Let's start with love. She had spent 20 years building a home, only to discover she'd been living in a house of cards all along. The rose petals formed a path from the front door to the dining room, each one placed with the precision of someone who still believed in forever. Garcelle Megan had started decorating at dawn, when the world was still wrapped in that soft blue darkness before sunrise. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lit the candles, the expensive ones that smelled like vanilla and promises. The kind she only bought for special occasions because Denzel always said they were wasteful. But tonight wasn't about practicality. Tonight marked 20 years of marriage, 2 decades of waking up beside the same man, of building a life that was supposed to mean something. The dining table gleamed under candlelight. She'd spent hours cleaning every surface until it reflected her face back at her, a face she barely recognized anymore. When had the lines around her eyes become so deep? When had her smile started looking like something she'd borrowed from someone else? She pushed the thoughts away and focused on the letter she'd written, her handwriting flowing across cream-colored paper in loops and curves that spelled out devotion. 20 years ago, you made me believe in fairy tales, the letter began. You made me believe that love could be a house with strong walls and warm light. Thank you for every morning, every evening, every moment in between. She'd rewritten it 5 times, trying to capture everything she felt, the gratitude, the love, the quiet desperation of wanting to matter to someone who'd stopped seeing her years ago. But she'd settled on simple words because complicated ones felt like begging, and she still had some pride left. Buried deep beneath the exhaustion, Garcelle checked her reflection in the hallway mirror one more time. The burgundy dress hugged her body in ways that made her feel almost beautiful again. Denzel had told her once, back when they were young and stupid with love, that burgundy made her look like poetry. She'd remembered that comment for 2 decades, pulling it out on lonely nights when she needed proof that he'd once looked at her with desire instead of tolerance. Her phone buzzed. A text from Denzel, coming home. The twins are with me. Something in those words felt wrong. The twins, Noah and Nora, had their own apartment across town. Why would they be coming tonight? She'd planned this anniversary as an intimate evening, just her and Denzel. A chance to remember who they'd been before parenthood and bills, and the slow erosion of everything tender. She typed back, "Wonderful. Dinner is ready." The lie tasted bitter. Dinner wasn't ready because she'd been planning to order from that Italian restaurant Denzel loved, the one with the tablecloths that felt like clouds and the wine that cost more than her weekly grocery budget. She'd saved money for months to afford tonight. Skipping lunches, wearing the same 3 outfits on rotation, cutting corners everywhere, except on the fantasy that tonight might save them. The front door opened precisely at 7. No warning, no gentle knock, just the sudden invasion of sound and presence. Denzel walked in first, his suit immaculate, his face carved from stone. Behind him, Noah and Nora followed, and the moment Garcelle saw their expressions, something inside her chest began to crack. Denzel. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "What's happening?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked past the rose petals without looking down, crushing them beneath his expensive shoes. The scent of crushed flowers filled the air, sweet and dying. He stopped at the dining table, glanced at the candles with something that looked like contempt, and placed 2 leather folders on the surface where her letter still waited. "Sit down, Garcelle." Not honey, not baby, just her name, spoken like it was something distasteful in his mouth. "I don't understand." She looked at the twins, searching their faces for explanation, for mercy, for anything recognizable. But Noah wouldn't meet her eyes, and Nora's expression held something Garcelle had never seen before. Cold determination. "Just sit," Denzel repeated, his voice flat as highway asphalt. Garcelle sat, her legs suddenly unreliable. The burgundy dress felt ridiculous now, too tight, too desperate, too much proof of how little she understood about her own life. Denzel opened the first folder and pushed it toward her. Even upside down she could read the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." The world tilted. The candles blurred into streams of light. The rose petals on the floor looked like blood drops in her peripheral vision. "Divorce papers." Denzel said it like he was discussing the weather. "I need you to sign them." "Why?" The word barely made it past her throat. "Why?" Denzel laughed, a sound without humor, empty as abandoned houses. "Because you've been a ghost in your own life, Garcelle. You stopped mattering years ago. You're just here, taking up space, breathing air, existing without purpose." Each word landed like a fist. Garcelle gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white against the dark wood. "That's not true," her voice shook. "I've given you everything. I gave up fashion school for you. I gave up my dreams so you could build your consultancy. I raised our children while you traveled for work. I made this house a home." "A home?" Nora's voice cut through like broken glass. "Mother, you made this house a museum to your martyrdom. Every conversation is about sacrifice. Every dinner is about what you gave up. We're suffocating under the weight of your disappointment." The word mother came out twisted, ugly, like something Nora wanted to spit out. "I never made you feel that way." Garcelle turned to her daughter, reaching across the table, but Nora pulled back as if her touch was contamination. "Everything I did because I love you. Both of you." Noah finally spoke, his voice quiet but devastating. "You're not our mother anymore. You're just this presence that reminds us of obligation. We don't need you. We never really did." Garcelle felt something fundamental break inside her, not her heart, because hearts break slowly over years of small cuts. This was different. This was the complete shattering of the person she'd built herself into. 20 years of identity, of purpose, of reason for breathing, all of it disintegrating in a candlelit room that smelled like vanilla and ending. "Sign the papers," Denzel said again, pushing the second folder toward her. "This one transfers your share of the consultancy to me. You helped build it early on, so legally you're entitled to half. But we both know you didn't really contribute anything significant. I'm being generous by giving you a clean break. No alimony demands, no messy court battles. Just sign, and we can all move on with our lives." "Generous?" The word tasted like poison. "You think erasing me from everything I helped create is generous?" "I think," Denzel leaned forward, his eyes dead of anything resembling love, "that you should be grateful I'm not making you fight for scraps. You're a middle-aged woman with no skills, no education beyond that semester of fashion school you keep mourning, and no prospects. Where else would you go? What else would you do? This is mercy, Garcelle. Take it." She looked at the papers, then at her family, these 3 people she'd devoted her entire adult life to, who now sat before her like judges delivering a sentence. The letter she'd written lay forgotten beside Denzel's elbow. He hadn't even glanced at it. "If I sign these," Garcelle whispered, "do I get to take anything? My clothes? Your clothes?" Nora laughed, cruel and bright. "You mean those sad outfits you wear on repeat? Mother, do yourself a favor and leave them. Start fresh. Become someone new. Someone less pathetic." The word hung in the air like smoke. Pathetic. Her own daughter had called her pathetic. Garcelle picked up the pen, her hand steady now. Shock doing what courage couldn't. She signed the divorce papers first, her signature looking foreign and cramped. Then the business transfer documents, watching herself give away the consultancy she'd helped create, back when Denzel was just a man with ideas, and she was the woman who'd believed in them. "There," she said, pushing the papers back across the table. "Is there anything else you need from the ghost?" Denzel gathered the documents, checking her signatures with the thoroughness of someone completing a transaction. "That's everything. You can stay here tonight, but I'd appreciate it if you were gone by morning." "Stay here." Garcelle stood, her legs somehow holding her weight. "In this house we bought together. Sleep in the bedroom where we—" She stopped, the words too humiliating to speak. "No, I'll leave now. Where will you go?" It was Noah asking, and for a brief moment she thought she heard concern in his voice. But when she met his eyes, they were empty of anything resembling care. "I have no idea," Garcelle answered honestly, "but I imagine that's no longer your concern." She walked to the hallway, picked up her purse from where it hung by the door, and turned back one final time. The three of them sat at the table, the candles still burning, the rose petals still scattered, a perfect tableau of destruction disguised as domestic life. "I loved you," she said to all of them, to none of them. "I loved you so much that I forgot to love myself. And now I can't even remember who I was before I became yours." "That's your problem, Garcelle," Denzel replied, his voice bored already. "You made us your entire personality. That's not love. That's obsession." She pulled her wedding ring from her finger, the simple gold band they'd bought when money was tight and promises were everything. She set it on the small table by the door, watching it spin for a moment before settling into stillness. The night air hit her face like a slap, cold and clarifying. Behind her, she heard Denzel's voice carrying through the open door. "Where will you even go? You're nothing without this family." Garcelle kept walking, her heels clicking against the driveway pavement, each step carrying her away from the only life she'd known, toward a future that looked like falling through darkness with no ground in sight. The burgundy dress that had made her feel almost beautiful now felt like a costume for a play that had closed without applause. She reached her car, a sedan Denzel had bought her years ago, practical and forgettable, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Through the windshield, she could see the house lit up like something from a magazine spread. Perfect exterior, rotting foundation. She'd polished that lie for 20 years. Her phone buzzed with a text from Denzel. "Left your house keys on the table. Don't come back for them." Garcelle looked at the message until the screen went dark, then finally started the car. The engine turned over with a reluctant cough, and she pulled away from the curb, away from the house, away from the family that had just signed her death certificate. She drove without destination, tears finally coming, now that no one could see them break her apart. The city lights blurred into watercolor smears. She had no money beyond the $50 in her wallet. No friends who weren't really Denzel's friends first. No family. Her parents had passed years ago, and she'd been an only child. Just herself. Just Garcelle Megan, whoever that was beneath the ash and rubble. She pulled into a shopping center parking lot, killed the engine, and sat in the darkness wondering if it was possible to die from having your soul ripped out while your body kept breathing. The night stretched ahead, long and empty, and hers alone. Quarter two, sleeping in cars and dreaming in colored dawn, arrived without permission, painting the shopping center parking lot in shades of gray that matched Garcelle's soul. She'd slept in the back seat of her car, curled into a position that made her spine scream complaints. Every muscle ached from the cramped space, but the physical pain was almost welcome, something concrete to focus on instead of the howling void where her life used to be. A security guard tapped on her window around 6 in the morning, his face a mixture of suspicion and pity. "Ma'am, you can't stay here. I'll need you to move along." Garcelle sat up, her burgundy dress wrinkled beyond recognition, her hair a disaster of tangles and regret. "I'm going," she managed, her voice rough from crying in her sleep. She caught her reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Red-rimmed eyes, mascara tracking down her cheeks like war paint, lips cracked from breathing through her mouth all night. This was what abandonment looked like on a human face. The car started on the third try, coughing exhaust into the cold morning air. Garcelle drove to a gas station, parked near the bathrooms, and went inside with her purse clutched tight against her ribs. The attendant, a teenager with purple hair and bored eyes, didn't look up from his phone as she passed. In the bathroom mirror, under fluorescent lights that made everything look like a crime scene, Garcelle tried to salvage some dignity. She scrubbed her face with rough paper towels and cold water, washing away the makeup and the tears and the evidence of collapse. The burgundy dress looked obscene in daylight, Too fancy, too desperate, screaming divorce celebration gone nuclear. A woman came in while Garcelle was bent over the sink, splashing water on her neck. The woman glanced at her, then away, then back again. That particular dance people do when they're trying to decide if someone needs help or just needs to be left alone. "You all right, honey?" the woman asked finally, her southern accent thick as morning syrup. "Fine," Garcelle lied. "Just a long night?" The woman nodded, unconvinced, and disappeared into a stall. Garcelle dried her face and hands, finger-combed her hair into something resembling order, and walked out before any more questions could land. She sat in her car and counted the money in her wallet. $53.22, her entire net worth. She had no bank account in her own name. Everything had been joint accounts that Denzel controlled. Her credit cards were probably already cancelled. She was essentially homeless, broke, and invisible. The realization should have destroyed her. Instead, it sparked something small and fierce in her chest. Not hope. Hope was too generous a word, but maybe defiance. Maybe the first molecule of anger. She drove through the city streets, seeing her surroundings differently now. Before, she'd navigated as someone's wife, someone's mother, always in relation to other people. Now she was just Garcelle, and the city looked foreign and sharp with possibility. A help-wanted sign in a dry cleaner's window caught her attention. She pulled over, checked her face one more time, and walked inside. The shop smelled like steam and chemicals and other people's lives. An elderly Korean woman stood behind the counter, sorting through plastic-wrapped garments with the efficiency of someone who'd done this for decades. "You need dry cleaning?" the woman asked without looking up. "I need a job," Garcelle answered. Now the woman looked up, her eyes shrewd and measuring. She took in Garcelle's wrinkled dress, her desperate posture, her empty hands. "You ever worked dry cleaning before?" "No," Garcelle admitted. "But I learn fast, and I need work more than I need pride right now." The woman studied her for a long moment, seeing something in Garcelle's face that made her nod slowly. "I'm Mrs. Kim. I pay minimum wage, cash daily, no questions about your past. You work hard, you keep working. You slack, you gone. Understand?" "I understand. You start now. There's an apron in the back." Garcelle spent that first day learning the machinery, the massive pressing machines that could take off a finger if you weren't careful, the chemical baths that made her eyes water, the rhythm of sorting and tagging and hanging. Her hands, soft from years of avoiding real work, developed blisters by noon. Mrs. Kim watched her with hawk-like attention, occasionally correcting her technique, but mostly letting her struggle through. During a brief lunch break, the old woman brought Garcelle a container of kimchi and rice from her own meal. "You're running from something," Mrs. Kim said. "It wasn't a question. Everything," Garcelle replied, accepting the food with gratitude that made her throat tight. "Good. Running means you're still moving. It's the ones who stay that die slowly." They ate in companionable silence, and Garcelle felt the first thread of something she might eventually call hope. At the end of the shift, Mrs. Kim counted out bills and pressed them into Garcelle's palm. $60. You come back tomorrow, same time. Garcelle stared at the money like it was magic. She'd earned this. Not through marriage, not through sacrifice, but through her own hands doing actual work. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me. You earned it." Big difference. Garcelle left the dry cleaner as the sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that looked like forgiveness. She had $60 and blistered hands and something that might eventually turn into a plan. She drove to a neighborhood she'd never visited when she was Mrs. Cooper, an area where the buildings leaned against each other for support and the street signs were graffitied into incomprehensible art. A hand-painted sign advertised rooms for rent. The building manager was a man who'd clearly seen every kind of desperation humanity could manufacture. He looked at Garcelle's rumpled dress and desperate eyes and named his price. First week up front, $80. Shared bathroom down the hall. No visitors after 10. No noise that makes me come upstairs. "I only have 60, Garcelle said. He sighed, scratched his unshaven jaw, and nodded. 60 now, 20 by Friday. You miss that payment, you're out. Room 310. Third floor, no elevator. The room was barely larger than a closet. A single bed with a mattress that had seen better decades. A dresser with 2 drawers that stuck. A window overlooking an alley where cats fought over garbage. The walls were water-stained and thin as paper. She could hear every sound from the neighboring rooms. Television laugh tracks. Arguments in languages she didn't recognize. A baby crying somewhere above her. It was perfect. Garcelle sat on the edge of the bed and felt the reality settle over her like snow. This was her life now. No rose petals, no candlelight, no anniversary celebrations. Just a room in a building that smelled like cooking oil and defeat, in a neighborhood where people understood survival. She lay back on the bed, still wearing the burgundy dress, and stared at the water-stained ceiling. A crack ran across the plaster in a pattern that looked almost like a map, paths branching and intersecting, leading nowhere and everywhere. That night, she couldn't sleep, despite exhaustion sitting on her chest like concrete. Instead, she pulled a pen from her purse, the same pen she'd used to sign away her marriage, and found a napkin from the gas station crumpled in her pocket. She started drawing. Not consciously, not with any plan, just letting her hand move across the paper, creating lines and shapes that suggested fabric, flow, movement. A dress design emerged from the scribbles, something elegant and impossible. The kind of garment she used to dream about before pregnancy and diapers, and the slow suffocation of becoming someone's appendage. She'd forgotten she knew how to do this. Fashion school felt like a past life, a girl she'd buried under 20 years of someone else's expectations. But her hand remembered, her eye remembered. Some part of her that Denzel and the twins hadn't managed to kill remembered who she'd been before she became theirs. Garcelle drew until her hand cramped, until the napkin was covered in sketches that looked like prayers written in pencil. Then she folded the napkin carefully, placed it in the empty dresser drawer, and finally let sleep take her under. Her dreams were full of fabric flowing like water, of colors she'd forgotten existed, of a woman who looked like her but stood taller, walked prouder, took up space without apologizing. The next morning, she woke to sunlight streaming through the dirty window, hitting her face like a challenge. Her body ached from the lumpy mattress and yesterday's labor. The burgundy dress was hopelessly wrinkled. She had one set of clothes to her name and $20 left until Friday's payment, but she had somewhere to be. Work waiting at the dry cleaner, money she could earn with her own hands, a room with a lock that answered only to her key. Garcelle stood, stretched the soreness from her muscles, and looked at herself in the dresser's cloudy mirror. The woman staring back wasn't Mrs. Cooper anymore, wasn't Noah and Nora's mother, was barely Garcelle Megan yet, but she was becoming something, and that was enough for now. Chapter 3. Threads of Resurrection. The boarding house revealed its secrets slowly, like someone learning to trust again. Garcelle discovered the shared storage room on her 5th day there, following the sound of someone rummaging through forgotten things. The door stood half open at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway, revealing a space stuffed with the abandoned possessions of previous tenants, who'd moved on or moved out or simply disappeared into whatever came next. An older man was digging through boxes, muttering to himself in Spanish. He looked up when Garcelle appeared in the doorway, his weathered face breaking into a gap-toothed smile. "Looking for treasure?" he asked in heavily accented English. "Just curious," Garcelle replied. "Curiosity is how we survive," he said, pulling out a vintage radio and examining it with the care of an archaeologist. Everything in here belonged to someone who thought they'd need it someday. Then someday came and they didn't need it anymore. Funny how that works. He left with his radio, leaving Garcelle alone with the accumulated debris of other people's lives. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under her weight. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, some labeled in neat handwriting, others torn and spilling their contents like wounded animals. She picked through the chaos without purpose, just touching things that had once mattered to someone. A box of romance novels with cracked spines, a lamp shaped like a hula dancer, a collection of vinyl records still in their sleeves, and then in the corner, buried under a collapsed cardboard box and a blanket that smelled like mothballs, a sewing machine. Garcelle's breath caught. She pulled it out carefully, brushing away dust and cobwebs. It was old, the kind with a foot pedal and mechanical gears visible under the faceplate. The brand name had worn away, but the machine had the solid weight of things built to last forever. She sat on the floor beside it, running her fingers over the metal surface, and something cracked open inside her chest. Not grief this time, but recognition. This machine looked like the one her grandmother had owned, the one where Garcelle had learned to sew as a girl, creating doll clothes and dreaming of runways. That was before Denzel, before the twins, before she'd traded herself for the promise of being chosen. She carried the machine to her room, struggling under its weight, not caring that it left oil stains on the burgundy dress she still hadn't changed out of. In her tiny space, she set it on the dresser, pushing aside the few items she'd managed to buy at a thrift store: a toothbrush, a bar of soap, a comb. Mrs. Kim noticed the oil stains during her shift at the dry cleaner. "You ruin your dress," the old woman observed not unkindly. "I found something better," Garcelle said, and the words felt true. That evening, after another shift pressing other people's clothes, Garcelle stopped at a dollar store and bought cleaning supplies with money she couldn't afford to spend. Back in her room, she worked on the sewing machine like she was performing surgery on hope itself. She cleaned every surface with rubbing alcohol and cotton swabs, getting into the small spaces where decades of dust had settled. She oiled the gears with machine oil she'd borrowed from Mrs. Kim, working the pedals slowly to distribute the lubricant. The machine resisted at first, groaning like something waking from a long sleep, but gradually it began to move smoothly. Her neighbor knocked on the wall. "Whatever you're doing, it sounds like you're summoning demons." "Just fixing something broken," Garcelle called back. "In this building, good luck with that," came the reply, but the machine responded to patience and care. By midnight, it was running almost smoothly, the needle moving up and down in a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. Garcelle sat back, exhausted and exhilarated, and realized she was smiling, the first real smile since the anniversary disaster. The next morning, instead of going straight to work, she walked to a fabric store in a neighborhood where buses wheezed black smoke and street vendors sold everything from mangoes to bootleg DVDs. The store was tiny, crammed with bolts of fabric that spilled from shelves in riots of color and texture. An Indian woman sat behind the counter, reading a magazine and eating something that smelled like cardamom and ambition. "Can I help you?" she asked, barely looking up. "I need fabric," Garcelle said. "But I only have $15. Now the woman looked up, her eyes shrewd. $15 buys you scraps and clearance. Back corner. Anything with a red tag. Garcelle went to the back corner, where fabric ends and remnants were piled in bins like treasure waiting to be discovered. She dug through the chaos, pulling out pieces and holding them up to the fluorescent light. Most were too damaged or too small to be useful. But then her fingers touched something that made her pause, a length of midnight blue silk, maybe 2 yards, with a small tear along one edge. It was marked down to $7. She found more pieces: emerald green cotton, cream-colored linen with a wine stain that could be cut around, a scrap of silver thread that caught the light like captured starlight. Altogether, she spent $12, leaving her with $3 until Friday's payment on the room. Back at the boarding house, she spread her treasures on the bed and felt something she'd forgotten existed: excitement about tomorrow. That night, she cut her first pattern freehand using newspaper she'd found in the storage room. The dress design came from the napkin she'd sketched on that first horrible night, an elegant silhouette that would flow like water, that would make whoever wore it feel like they were worth looking at. She cut the midnight blue silk with scissors borrowed from Mrs. Kim, each snip deliberate and irreversible. There was no going back once fabric was cut. No apologies, no second chances, just commitment to the vision. The sewing machine coughed through the first seam, the thread tension wrong, the stitches uneven. Garcelle adjusted, tried again, failed, adjusted more. Her back ached from hunching over. Her eyes burned from the dim light of the single bulb hanging from the ceiling. But the dress began to take shape, imperfect, amateur, but undeniably real. She worked through the night, stopping only when the machine jammed or her vision blurred too badly to see straight. By dawn, she had something that resembled a dress. The hem was slightly crooked. The neckline didn't sit quite right, but when she held it up to the dirty window, letting sunrise pour through the fabric, it looked like possibility-wearing thread. Garcelle put on the dress, standing in front of the dresser mirror. It fit her body like it had been designed specifically for her architecture, because it had been. Every curve, every angle, every place where her body told stories of bearing children and bearing grief. The mirror showed her something she hadn't seen in years, a woman who looked like she might have something to say. She wore the dress to the Sunday market that sprawled across 6 blocks in the neighborhood's commercial district. Vendors sold everything: vegetables still wearing garden dirt, knockoff designer bags, tamales wrapped in corn husks, used electronics of questionable legality. The air smelled like cilantro and exhaust, and the particular optimism of people trying to make rent through sheer determination. Garcelle walked through the market, not selling anything, just existing in public wearing something she'd created. People noticed. Not everyone, but enough. A woman selling handmade jewelry caught her arm as she passed. "That dress," the woman said. "Where did you buy it?" "I didn't buy it," Garcelle answered. "I made it." The woman circled her slowly, examining the construction with expert eyes. "You selling?" "I need something like this for my daughter's engagement party. Something that doesn't scream cheap but doesn't cost my rent money." Garcelle's mind went blank. She hadn't thought about selling. This was her only dress besides the ruined burgundy one. "How much would you pay?" she heard herself ask. The woman named a number that was 3 days' wages at the dry cleaner. "Give me your number," Garcelle said, her voice steady despite her heart trying to escape her chest. "I'll make you something." She took orders from 3 more women that day, all of them drawn to the dress like moths to specific light. They wanted clothes that understood their bodies, that celebrated instead of concealed, that didn't cost what the department stores demanded for the privilege of looking presentable. Garcelle went home with their contact information and a commission list and the terrifying realization that she might have just started something that could save her. She worked double shifts at the dry cleaner while sewing at night, sleeping in 90-minute increments, surviving on coffee and the particular stubbornness of people who've decided dying is no longer an option. Her fingers bled from needle pricks. Her eyes developed permanent red veins. Mrs. Kim noticed but said nothing, just left small containers of food on the counter during breaks. Rice, kimchi, mysterious soups that tasted like someone's grandmother had poured love into a pot. The first dress Garcelle delivered made the client cry. Not sad tears, the kind that come from being seen. The woman put on the emerald green creation and stared at herself in her own mirror, touching the fabric like it might disappear. "Who made this?" she whispered. "I did," Garcelle said, and the words felt like claiming citizenship in a country she'd been exiled from. The woman paid her in cash, worn bills that smelled like life and possibility. She also took a photograph, posting it online with words that would change everything. "Found this designer working out of nowhere. She makes you look like you matter." The post spread. Orders came in faster than Garcelle could fulfill them. She had to start turning people down, which felt like luxury and torture in equal measure. Her tiny room became a workshop, fabric covering every surface, thread spools organized by color, pattern pieces hanging from strings she'd strung across the ceiling. Other residents started noticing. The nurse from down the hall asked for a dress for her daughter's graduation. The taxi driver wanted something for his anniversary. The teacher who'd lost her certification asked if Garcelle needed help cutting fabric. Garcelle hired her, paying what she could afford, teaching her skills that could outlast anyone's rejection. Then she hired the nurse's sister, a woman who'd fled an abusive marriage with nothing but her hands and her hunger to survive. They worked together in that tiny room, 3 women creating clothes that told stories about refusing to disappear. Garcelle's reputation grew through the particular magic of people who've been ignored, recognizing someone who sees them. No website, no advertising, just word spreading through neighborhoods where survival was an art form and resources were shared like oxygen. She opened a tiny commercial space, barely more than a closet with a cracked window, in a building scheduled for demolition. The landlord, a man who'd also survived abandonment, gave her a break on the rent because he recognized the look in her eyes, desperation transformed into determination. 3 months, he said. Then the building comes down. Make what you can while you can. Garcelle and her small team moved the sewing machines and supplies into the space, transforming it into an atelier that smelled like fresh paint and fierce intention. They hung a sign in the window, hand-painted by the teacher, Megan Originals. Not Cooper, Megan, her own name reclaimed. The 3-month deadline approached, then passed. The demolition got delayed for reasons no one could explain. Permits, inspections, bureaucratic mysteries. It felt like the universe bending slightly in her direction, or at least stopping its determined crushing of her existence. Orders kept coming. The tiny space filled with the sound of sewing machines creating armor disguised as clothing. And late at night, when everyone else had gone home, Garcelle would stand at the cracked window, looking out at the city that had tried to swallow her whole, and whisper, "I'm still here, still breathing, still becoming." Chapter 4. The Billionaire's Offer and a Woman's Pride. The town car looked obscene parked outside her tiny atelier, all gleaming black paint and tinted windows, like a shark that had swum into a goldfish pond by mistake. Garcelle noticed it through her cracked window while pinning a hem on a client's dress. The car had been sitting there for 10 minutes, engine running, making the neighborhood kids circle it with the particular fascination of people recognizing wealth from a distance. When the door finally opened, a man stepped out wearing a suit that probably cost more than her first year's rent at the boarding house. He was black, somewhere in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of posture that suggested he'd never apologized for taking up space. He looked at her building, leaning, graffitied, held together by hope and duct tape, with an expression Garcelle couldn't quite read. Then he walked toward her door. "Someone important is coming," the teacher called out, her voice tight with the nervousness of people who'd learned that important men rarely brought good news. The man knocked, despite the door being halfway open, a courtesy that surprised Garcelle. "I'm looking for the designer," he said. "Garcelle Megan? That's me." She set down her pincushion, wiping her hands on her work pants. "Can I help you?" He extended his hand. "Peter Williams. I wonder if we could talk privately." The name registered vaguely. She'd seen it in magazines, on billboards, in news articles about venture capital and sustainable business practices. Peter Williams was the kind of wealthy that made other wealthy people nervous. Garcelle glanced at her 2 employees, who'd both stopped working to stare. "It's fine," she told them. "Take your lunch break early." They gathered their things and left, casting suspicious looks at Peter Williams on their way out. When the door closed behind them, Garcelle turned back to this man who'd brought his expensive town car into her neighborhood, like an ambassador from a country she'd been exiled from. "Mr. Williams." "Peter, please." He looked around the tiny space, taking in the sewing machines, the fabric piles, the patterns pinned to the walls. "You built this yourself." It wasn't a question, but Garcelle answered anyway. "With help. I don't do anything alone anymore if I can help it." He nodded slowly, picking up a finished dress from the rack, midnight blue with silver threading, part of a small collection she'd been preparing. He examined it with the careful attention of someone who understood quality. "I've been following your work," he said, "or trying to. You're difficult to track down. No website, no social media presence, no business registration that I could find, but your designs keep showing up on women who look like they've discovered themselves for the first time." Garcelle felt her defenses rising. "I'm not hiding. I'm just working." "I can see that." Peter set down the dress carefully. "I invest in fashion, sustainable brands, ethical manufacturing, designers who understand that clothes can be revolutionary. Your work fits that profile. More than fits it, actually. It embodies it." Here it comes, Garcelle thought. The offer with strings attached. "I'd like to invest in Megan Originals," Peter continued. "Startup capital to expand beyond this space. Connections to manufacturers who could scale your production while maintaining quality. Introductions to buyers who could get your designs into boutiques across the country. A proper studio in the arts district with actual light and enough room to grow. Everything you'd need to turn this," he gestured around the tiny space, "into an empire." The word empire hung in the air like an impossible promise. "And what would you own in return?" Garcelle asked, her voice sharper than she'd intended. Peter smiled slightly. "Direct, I appreciate that. Standard venture capital arrangement. I'd take an equity stake, sit on the board, provide strategic guidance." "Control my vision," Garcelle translated. "Guide it," he corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" She moved to the window, looking out at the neighborhood that had taught her survival. "Because from where I'm standing, guidance sounds like a polite word for someone else deciding who I should become." Peter was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its business pitch polish. "Can I tell you something? And I mean really tell you, not the investor speaking to the potential investment." Garcelle turned back to face him, surprised by the shift. "Go ahead." "I was in foster care until I aged out," he said. 11 different homes, 11 different versions of who people wanted me to be. Smart enough to get scholarships, but not smart enough to make white parents comfortable. Athletic, but not threatening. Ambitious, but grateful. I spent 18 years becoming whatever kept me fed and housed." He paused, and Garcelle saw something in his face she recognized, the scar tissue of survival. "When I finally got free," Peter continued, "I had nothing. No family, no support system, just a college scholarship and enough rage to power a city. I built my first company from scratch, took it public, sold it for more money than any of those foster parents ever dreamed of having. And you know what I learned?" "What?" Garcelle asked softly. "That the first thing you build yourself matters more than anything that comes after. Because it's proof. Proof that you can. Proof that you exist, independent of anyone's permission or belief. Once you have that proof, no one can ever make you doubt yourself again." The words landed in Garcelle's chest like arrows finding their target. "So here's the truth," Peter said. "Yes, I could accelerate your growth. Yes, I have resources and connections that would save you years of struggle. But if you take them now, you'll always wonder if you could have done it alone. And that wondering will poison every success you have afterward." Garcelle stared at him, this stranger who seemed to understand the exact shape of her hunger and her fear. "Are you telling me not to take your offer?" she asked. "I'm telling you that I see you," Peter replied. "Not the business opportunity. You, the woman who's rebuilding herself stitch by stitch because she needs to know she can. And that woman deserves to prove it to herself before anyone else gets to claim credit. Then why are you here? Because when you're ready, not for my money, but for genuine partnership between equals, I want you to remember this conversation. I want you to know that someone saw your worth when you were still discovering it yourself." Peter pulled out a business card, setting it on her work table. "No pressure, no timeline. Just an open door when you're ready to walk through it." He started toward the exit, then paused. "That dress you're wearing, did you make it?" Garcelle glanced down at the simple cotton dress she'd sewn for herself during a sleepless night. "Yes, it's perfect," he said. "Not because it's flawless. I can see the hem is a little uneven. But because it looks like you wore your story and didn't apologize for a single word." Then he was gone, the town car pulling away and leaving the neighborhood looking slightly more ordinary by comparison. Garcelle stood alone in her tiny atelier, holding his business card, feeling something she couldn't quite name. The teacher and the nurse's sister returned from lunch, chattering about the fancy car and the fancy man, asking questions Garcelle barely heard. She looked around her space, the cracked window, the ancient sewing machines, the fabric piles that were really piles of possibility. This was hers. She'd built it from absolutely nothing, while the people who'd claimed to love her turned their backs, and she wasn't done building yet. That evening, after her employees left, Garcelle stayed late working on a new design. Her hands moved across fabric with growing confidence, creating seams that told stories of survival without apology. She thought about Peter Williams's words, about building something yourself first, about needing proof that you existed independent of anyone's permission. She'd spent 20 years seeking permission to matter, to exist, to take up space in her own family. She'd signed papers erasing herself because she'd believed that's what love required, the complete dissolution of self. But here, in this tiny space in a building scheduled for demolition, she was creating something that answered only to her vision. Every dress she made was an argument against disappearing. Every client she dressed was a woman learning she deserved to be seen. Maybe Peter Williams was right. Maybe she needed to build this empire, if that's what it became, with her own bleeding hands first. Not because she didn't deserve help, but because she needed to know, bone deep and certain, that she was capable of survival without anyone's rescue. She pinned Peter's business card to the wall beside her patterns, not throwing it away but not using it either, just letting it exist as a reminder. Someone believed in her, but first she needed to believe in herself. Outside her window, the city lights flickered on as darkness fell. Street vendors were packing up their wares. A mother walked by, pulling 2 children along, both of them crying about something trivial and everything important. A bus wheezed past, carrying people toward home or away from it. Garcelle turned back to her work, threading the machine with silver that caught the overhead light like captured starlight. The dress taking shape beneath her hands would be beautiful, not because it was perfect, but because every stitch was an act of defiance against everyone who'd told her she was nothing. "Watch me," she whispered to the empty room. To Denzel and the twins who weren't there to hear, "Watch me build cathedrals with these hands you tried to bury." The sewing machine hummed its agreement, and Garcelle worked through the night, building her empire one small act of rebellion at a time. Chapter 5. Building Cathedrals from Rubble. The wedding dress commission arrived through a message that made Garcelle's hands shake. It came from a woman named Juliette, a janitor at a downtown hospital, who'd seen one of Garcelle's designs on a co-worker. Her daughter was getting married, and Juliette had exactly $400 saved for a dress. Department stores wanted 3 times that for something that made her daughter feel like an imposter in her own skin. "Can you make magic happen with this budget?" Juliette's message asked. "My girl deserves to feel like herself on her wedding day, not like she's playing dress-up in someone else's vision." Garcelle read the message 3 times, calculating fabric costs and labor hours, and the mathematics of making miracles happen on impossible budgets. $400 was barely enough. But she remembered being someone's daughter once, remembered her own mother scraping together money for her fashion school application fee before life intervened. She replied, "Tell me about your daughter. What makes her feel beautiful?" They met on a Sunday at Garcelle's atelier. Juliette brought her daughter Sophia, a girl in her early 20s, with her mother's eyes and the particular nervousness of people who'd learned to expect disappointment. Sophia moved through the tiny space like she was afraid of breaking something, touching nothing, apologizing for existing. "Don't apologize," Garcelle said gently. "This space is for women who've been made to feel like they're too much or not enough. You're exactly right here." She spent an hour just talking to Sophia, not about dresses, but about who she was beneath the wedding planning stress. Sophia worked at a community center teaching art to kids. She loved bright colors, but always wore gray because bright felt like asking for attention. She wanted to feel like herself on her wedding day. But herself had been buried under so many people's opinions, she'd forgotten what that even meant. "Tell me," Garcelle said, "if no one was watching, if you weren't worried about what anyone thought, what would make you feel powerful?" Sophia's answer came out small at first, then stronger. "Yellow. I'd wear yellow like sunshine. Something that moves when I move, that doesn't hold me still like I'm made of porcelain." Garcelle nodded, sketching while Sophia talked. Her dress emerged on paper, flowing, unconventional, the color of hope that refuses to be quiet. "This," she said, showing Sophia the sketch. "But only if it feels like you." Sophia started crying, the kind of tears that come from being seen after years of invisibility. "How did you know?" "Because I spent 20 years wearing what everyone else wanted," Garcelle answered. "I know what it looks like when someone's drowning in other people's expectations." She made that dress with more care than she'd given anything. Yellow silk that caught light like captured joy. A flowing skirt that would move like water. Details that celebrated Sophia's body instead of demanding it apologize. She worked through nights, sleeping in 90-minute increments, surviving on coffee and the particular stubbornness of women who decided other women's happiness mattered. The teacher and the nurse's sister helped with the detail work, hand-stitching beading, creating delicate embroidery that told stories in thread. They worked together in that tiny space, building something that felt like more than a dress. When Sophia came for the final fitting, she put on the dress and went completely still. Then she started laughing, not polite laughter, but the kind that comes from finding yourself after being lost. "This is me," she whispered, touching the fabric like it might vanish. "This is actually me." Her mother Juliet took photographs with her phone, tears streaming down her face. "My baby looks like she's made of sunlight." The wedding happened on a Saturday in a community center gym, decorated with string lights and homemade flowers. Garcelle wasn't invited, but Juliet sent her photographs afterward. Sophia glowing in yellow silk, surrounded by people who loved her loudly and without conditions. Then Juliet posted the photos online with words that would change everything. "This designer made my daughter's dreams fit her budget and her soul. She's working miracles out of a closet across town. Someone should know about her." The post went viral, shared thousands of times by women who understood the violence of not being able to afford to feel beautiful. Orders flooded in faster than Garcelle could process them. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from strangers asking if she could make magic happen for them too. She had to make a decision: keep working from the tiny space, turning down most requests, or find a way to expand. The building's demolition had been delayed again. Bureaucratic mysteries no one could explain. But it felt temporary, like living on borrowed time. Garcelle needed something more permanent, more solid. She counted her savings, money earned one exhausting shift at a time, one dress at a time. It wasn't enough for a real space in a decent neighborhood, but it was enough for something. She found a small storefront in the fashion district, barely more than a box with windows, sandwiched between a Thai restaurant and a vintage record shop. The rent was just at the edge of what she could afford if she didn't eat and didn't sleep and didn't have any emergencies. "I'll take it," she told the landlord, signing papers that felt less like a death sentence than the divorce documents had. Moving day required everything Garcelle owned and several things she had to borrow. She'd bought a used truck from a lot that specialized in vehicles with questionable histories, a battered Ford with seats held together by duct tape and an engine that sounded like it was digesting rocks. The nurse's sister had a boyfriend who drove trucks for a living. His name was Marcus, and he showed up on moving day with the practiced exhaustion of someone who'd worked too hard for too long. "So you're the designer everyone's talking about," he said, loading sewing machines into the truck bed with surprising gentleness. "I'm trying to be," Garcelle replied. They made 3 trips between the old atelier and the new storefront, the truck groaning under the weight of her accumulated equipment and supplies. Marcus drove with the careful attention of someone who understood that these weren't just things. They were someone's entire existence packed into cardboard and hope. On the 3rd trip, stopped at a red light, he asked, "How'd you end up here, building all this?" Garcelle watched the city move past the truck's dirty windows, people rushing toward their lives or away from them, everyone carrying invisible weight. "I had a choice," she said slowly. "Die quietly or become impossible to ignore. Turns out I'm terrible at dying." Marcus laughed, a sound that understood survival from the inside. "Yeah, I know that choice. Made it myself after my first wife took everything, including my belief that I mattered. Took me 3 years to remember I was a person before I was her husband." They sat in comfortable silence after that. 2 people who'd learned the same lessons in different languages. The new storefront smelled like paint and possibility. Garcelle and her small team spent a weekend transforming it, scrubbing floors, painting walls in colors that felt like optimism, arranging sewing machines in configurations that allowed for growth. She hung her first dress in the window, the midnight blue one with silver threading, and hand-painted a sign. Megan Originals, not hiding anymore, not apologizing, just existing loudly enough to be heard. The neighborhood noticed. The Thai restaurant owner brought pad Thai as a welcome gift. The record shop owner offered to share Wi-Fi. Other small business owners stopped by to introduce themselves, a coalition of people who'd all bet against the odds that said they should give up. Orders kept multiplying. Garcelle hired 2 more seamstresses, both women who'd been invisible in other places, who knew what it meant to be dismissed. She paid fair wages, taught skills that could outlast anyone's rejection, created a space where surviving wasn't shameful. Her reputation spread through the particular magic of women recognizing someone who saw them. No fancy marketing, no expensive advertising, just word of mouth carrying her name through neighborhoods where resources were shared like oxygen. A fashion blogger discovered her work at a community event and wrote, "Mystery designer creating couture that understands real bodies and real budgets. In a world of fashion that demands women apologize for existing, she's making clothes that celebrate survival." The article was shared thousands of times. Suddenly Garcelle's tiny storefront had lines outside, women waiting hours for consultations, bringing stories of their bodies and their lives, asking if she could make them feel seen. She worked 16-hour days, sleeping on a cot in the back room, surviving on takeout and the particular rage of women who decided they would not be erased. Her hands developed permanent calluses. Her eyes had red veins that wouldn't fade. But every dress she created felt like an argument against disappearing. Late one night, alone in the shop, after everyone else had gone home, Garcelle stood at the front window, looking out at the city. Her reflection stared back, thinner than before, tired in ways that went bone-deep but undeniably present. She'd survived the anniversary betrayal, survived sleeping in her car, survived the boarding house and the dry cleaner and the tiny closet of an atelier. And now she stood in her own storefront with her own name on the window, creating clothes that told stories about refusing to be quiet. "Still here," she whispered to her reflection. "Still breathing. Still becoming something you didn't think I could be." Her phone buzzed. Another order request. Another woman asking if Garcelle could make magic happen. She smiled and texted back, "Tell me your story." We'll create something that honors it. Outside, the city continued its endless movement, people rushing toward futures they hoped would be kinder than their pasts. And inside her small storefront, Garcelle Megan stood surrounded by fabric and thread and the accumulated proof that she'd refused to die when dying would have been easier. The sewing machines waited silently, ready for morning, ready for the next act of resurrection. Chapter 6. When your name starts meaning something. The celebrity stylist's message arrived at 3 in the morning, which was perfect because Garcelle hadn't slept yet anyway. I need 20 custom pieces for a film premiere. Major actress, major visibility. 4 weeks. Name your price. Garcelle read the message 6 times before her brain accepted it was real. This wasn't another local order, another woman looking for a dress that fit both her body and her budget. This was the kind of opportunity that separated people who had potential from people who became forces. She typed back, "Send me her measurements and the mood you're going for. I'll need fabric costs up front and 4 weeks, not 3. Quality bows to no deadline." The response came within minutes. "Deal. Welcome to the big time." Garcelle sat in her backroom workshop, surrounded by fabric and thread and half-finished dreams, and felt terror mixing with something that might eventually become confidence. This was the door opening. Everything she did next would either prove she belonged or prove everyone right who'd said she was nothing. She called an emergency meeting with her team, 5 seamstresses now, all women who'd found their way to her through the invisible network of people society overlooked. They gathered in the storefront before dawn, drinking coffee that tasted like battery acid and ambition. "We have 4 weeks to create 20 pieces for a Hollywood premiere," Garcelle announced. "It's going to be brutal. Long hours, no mistakes, everything perfect. I can't pay you more than our standard rates, but I can promise you that if we do this right, your names will be on something that matters." The teacher spoke first. "Do we get to tell people we made clothes for a movie star?" "You get to tell people you made art," Garcelle corrected. "The movie star part is just details." They worked like they were building temples instead of dresses. Garcelle designed each piece specifically for the actress's measurements, flowing gowns that would move like water on camera, structured jackets that would photograph like armor, casual pieces that would make paparazzi shots look editorial. The fabrics arrived in boxes that cost more than her first month's rent at the boarding house. Silk that felt like touching moonlight, cashmere that made you understand why people wrote poetry about texture, linen so fine it could have been woven from clouds. Garcelle cut each pattern herself, not trusting anyone else with fabric this expensive, this unforgiving. One mistake would cost hundreds of dollars. Her hands shook the first time she put scissors to silk. But then muscle memory took over, the same confidence she'd developed sewing scraps into survival. The team worked in shifts, the storefront transforming into a factory of focused intensity. Thread colors had to match perfectly. Seams had to lie flat without puckering. Hems had to be invisible. Everything had to be flawless, because this wasn't just about one client, it was about proving Garcelle Megan belonged in conversations with names that mattered. Peter Williams called 2 weeks into the project. "Heard through the fashion grapevine you landed the premiere commission," he said, his voice warm with something that sounded like pride. "How's it going?" "I haven't slept in 4 days. My hands are cramping, and I'm fairly certain I've forgotten how to have thoughts that aren't about seam allowances," Garcelle replied. "So basically perfect," he laughed. "That's the voice of someone becoming who they're meant to be. Need anything? And before you refuse, I'm not offering money. Just checking if there's anything practical I can help with." Garcelle looked around her packed storefront at the chaos of creation happening in every corner. "Actually," she heard herself say, "could you send coffee? The good kind that doesn't taste like punishment. Enough for 6 women who've forgotten what sleep feels like." "Done. Anything else?" "Just don't tell me I should have taken your investment offer back then. I need to prove I could do this myself first." Garcelle Peter said gently. "You already proved at the moment you left that boarding house room and didn't give up. Everything else is just details." The coffee arrived an hour later, expensive espresso beans and a machine that looked like it belonged in an Italian cafe, not a scrappy fashion startup. The card attached said only, "For women building empires." PW. Her team stood around the machine like it was a religious artifact. The first sip of properly made coffee brought actual tears to the teacher's eyes. "Is this what rich people taste every morning?" she asked. "Apparently," Garcelle replied. "And now we do too." They finished the collection with 6 hours to spare, 20 pieces that made Garcelle's chest ache with the particular pride of creating something undeniably excellent. Each garment told a story, and together they formed a narrative about women who refused to apologize for taking up space. The stylist picked up the collection personally, spreading each piece across Garcelle's work table with the reverence usually reserved for holy objects. "These are stunning," she breathed. "Better than I imagined." "Who are you, really?" "Someone who learned to sew her own parachute while falling," Garcelle answered. The premiere happened on a Tuesday night. Red carpets and flashbulbs and cameras broadcasting to millions of people who suddenly wanted to know who dressed the actress glowing in midnight blue silk with silver threading. Garcelle watched from her tiny apartment. She'd finally upgraded from the boarding house to a studio with actual windows and saw her designs moving on a screen like living things. The actress gave interviews mentioning, "This incredible new designer who made me feel like myself in expensive packaging." By Wednesday morning, Garcelle's phone had exploded. Orders from stylists representing musicians, athletes, actresses who wanted pieces that combined fashion with feeling. Interview requests from magazines that had previously never heard her name. Boutique owners asking if they could carry her line. She sat on her apartment floor, overwhelmed by the sudden visibility, and called Peter Williams. "It's happening too fast," she said when he answered. "I'm not ready." "Yes, you are," he replied calmly. "You've been ready. You just didn't have the platform. Now you do. Question is, what are you going to do with it?" "I have no idea," Garcelle admitted. "Then figure it out. And remember, you built this with your own hands. No one gave it to you. That means no one can take it away unless you let them," she expanded, carefully, deliberately, making sure growth didn't mean losing the soul of what made Megan Originals matter. She hired more seamstresses, always women who'd been overlooked, always fair wages, always dignity in the work. She moved into a real studio in the fashion district, a space with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in light like benediction. Her designs started appearing on red carpets and magazine covers. Fashion critics called her the designer who understands that clothes should celebrate the wearer, not the other way around. Major retailers wanted to carry her line, but Garcelle refused. She wouldn't mass-produce, wouldn't compromise quality for profit, wouldn't become the thing she'd been fighting against. She opened 3 flagship stores simultaneously, a decision analysts called recklessly ambitious, but she called making up for lost time. One in her city, one in New York, one in Los Angeles. Each store designed to feel like someone's home instead of a temple to consumption. Awards followed. Entrepreneur of the Year from a magazine that typically ignored self-funded women. Fashion Innovator from an organization that usually only recognized designers who'd come from wealth or prestigious schools. Designer to Watch from publications that pretended they'd discovered her, conveniently forgetting they'd ignored her until success made her impossible to dismiss. Each trophy felt like stealing back pieces of herself that Denzel and the twins had tried to bury. She didn't display them prominently, just kept them in her apartment, where she could see them on mornings when doubt tried to convince her she'd imagined her own resurrection. Peter Williams became a fixture in her life, not as investor, not as romantic interest, but as the friend who understood what building something from nothing cost. They had coffee monthly, conversations ranging from supply chain logistics to childhood scars neither had fully healed from. "You ever think about them?" Peter asked during one of their meetings. "Your ex, your kids?" "Sometimes," Garcelle admitted. "Less than I used to. It's strange. They were my entire world, and now they're just people who happened to me once." "That's called healing," Peter observed. "Hurts like hell, doesn't it? Every single day." He smiled, understanding. "Good, means you're alive." Megan Originals became valued at 50 million, according to analysts who tracked such things. 50 million built from absolutely nothing, from a boarding house room and a stolen sewing machine and the particular stubbornness of a woman who'd refused to die quietly. Garcelle moved into a loft, apartment that felt like living inside light itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows, exposed brick, space to breathe without counting the cost. She hung her first dress, the midnight blue one from that first horrible night, in a frame on the wall, a reminder of how far she'd traveled from the woman who'd signed those divorce papers. Late at night, she'd stand at those windows, looking out at the city spread beneath her like a promise kept. Sometimes she thought about Denzel and the twins, wondered where they were, how they were surviving. Her private investigator sent monthly reports she both needed and hated. Denzel's consultancy had collapsed under debt and scandal, embezzlement charges, fraud allegations, the particular unraveling of empires built on lies. He'd moved to a small apartment, working odd jobs, his reputation destroyed beyond repair. Noah faced potential legal consequences for his involvement in the embezzlement scheme. The golden boy had tarnished, and the world was less forgiving than it had been when he had his mother to step on. Nora worked retail, her dreams of dynasty reduced to folding other people's clothes for minimum wage. The universe had a savage sense of irony. Garcelle should have felt vindicated, should have celebrated their downfall, should have felt the satisfaction of karma finally paying attention. Instead, she felt nothing, just the vast emptiness of watching strangers suffer in a language she no longer spoke. She designed a collection called After the Fall, garments that celebrated survival without apologizing for the mess of becoming. Dark colors transformed by unexpected light. Heavy fabrics made buoyant through construction. Clothes that said, "I survived what tried to kill me, and now I'm beautiful in ways you can't categorize." The collection sold out within hours. On the night of her studio's second anniversary, 2 years since leaving that tiny closet atelier, Garcelle threw a party. Not a corporate event with forced networking, but an actual celebration with the women who'd built this empire alongside her. Her seamstresses, her team, the clients who'd believed in her when believing was an act of faith. Peter Williams came, bringing champagne that cost more than reasonable, and making everyone laugh with stories about his own early failures. To Garcelle, he toasted, raising his glass, who taught us all that falling is just another way of learning to fly. They drank and laughed and celebrated the particular miracle of not giving up, when giving up would have been so much easier. And late that night, after everyone had gone home, Garcelle stood alone in her studio, surrounded by the evidence of her impossible journey, and whispered to the ghosts of who she'd been, "I'm still here, still breathing, and I've become something even I didn't dare imagine." Chapter 7, The Empire That Forgot to Ask Permission. The magazine cover arrived at Garcelle's loft by messenger, an advance copy before it hit newsstands nationwide. Her face stared back at her from glossy paper, photographed in one of her own designs against a stark white background. The headline read, "The Phoenix Designer, How Garcelle Megan Rose from Nothing to Redefine Fashion." She sat on her floor holding the magazine, tracing her own photographed face with fingers that remembered bleeding from needle pricks. This woman on the cover looked powerful, certain, like she'd never doubted her right to exist. Garcelle barely recognized her. The article inside told a sanitized version of her story, the divorce, the struggle, the rise. But it left out the visceral details. How she'd cried in gas station bathrooms. How she'd considered not waking up during those first weeks. How she'd survived on spite and stubbornness when hope felt like a language she'd forgotten. But what the article captured perfectly was the now. Megan Originals had become synonymous with what fashion could be when it stopped punishing women and started celebrating them. 3 flagship stores, a team of 40 employees, designs worn by everyone from actresses to activists, a brand valued at numbers that made her dizzy. The profile ended with a quote from an industry analyst. Garcelle Megan didn't just build a fashion empire. She revolutionized our understanding of what clothes can mean to women who've been told they're not enough. Peter Williams called minutes after the magazine arrived. "Saw the cover," he said. "You look like someone who conquered gravity. I feel like someone who's still learning not to fall," Garcelle replied. "Same thing, really. Conquering gravity is just falling and refusing to hit the ground," she laughed, the kind that came from exhaustion and exhilaration mixing in equal parts. "Are you calling me stubborn?" I'm calling you unstoppable," Peter corrected. "There's a difference." The magazine created a tidal wave. Suddenly, Garcelle was invited to speak at conferences, to sit on panels about entrepreneurship, to share her story with audiences who treated survival like inspiration instead of the daily brutality it actually was. She accepted some invitations, declined others. She spoke at a women's business summit, standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people, telling them the truth. People will tell you that success is about having vision, about being brave, about never giving up. And those things matter. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes success is just about being too stubborn to die, when dying would be so much easier. Sometimes it's about waking up every morning and deciding, just for today, I'll keep breathing. Just for today, I'll sew one more seam. Just for today, I won't believe the voices that say I'm nothing. The audience stood and applauded. But Garcelle saw the women in the back who weren't applauding, who were crying instead, recognizing themselves in her words. Those were the women she was speaking to. More awards came, accolades from organizations that had previously never heard her name. She accepted them with grace, but privately felt uncomfortable with the celebration. These trophies represented survival, not triumph. They were evidence of not dying, which felt like a strange thing to celebrate. Fashion Week invited her to show her collection, the kind of invitation designers spent careers chasing. She almost declined, uncomfortable with the industry's gatekeeping and arbitrary standards. But then she thought about all the women who'd never see themselves represented on those runways, and she accepted with conditions. Her models would represent real bodies, real ages, real lives. The show became legendary, not because it was shocking, but because it was honest. Models ranging from their 20s to their 60s walked the runway in clothes designed for humans instead of hangers. Bodies that had carried children, survived illness, lived entire lives, wore garments that celebrated every mark and curve. The fashion press called it revolutionary. Garcelle called it basic decency. Peter Williams attended the show, sitting front row with an expression of genuine pride. Afterward, in the chaos of backstage congratulations, he pulled her aside. "You did it," he said simply. "Did what?" "Built something that matters, not just commercially, though that's impressive too, but built something that changes how women see themselves. That's rare." Garcelle looked around at her team celebrating, at the models still in her designs laughing together, at the evidence of creating something larger than survival. "I was just trying not to disappear," she admitted. "You didn't just refuse to disappear," Peter replied. "You became impossible to ignore." There's poetry in that. Their friendship had deepened into something neither felt the need to define. The press constantly speculated about romance, crafting narratives about power couples and fashion world dynasties. They ignored the speculation with the particular ease of people who knew their truth didn't need public validation. Late one night, after a particularly exhausting gala where men kept asking Peter if he managed Garcelle's business, They sat in his car watching the city lights blink like distant stars. "Do you ever get tired of people assuming you're in charge?" Garcelle asked. "Every single day," Peter admitted. "But I've learned that other people's assumptions say more about them than about us. You built this empire. I'm just lucky enough to witness it." "You're more than a witness," Garcelle said softly. "You're the friend who believed in me before I believed in myself. That matters." "Then I'm doing something right," Peter replied. The press coverage intensified. Profiles in business magazines analyzing her strategies. Fashion publications dissecting her aesthetic. Lifestyle features about her loft apartment, her daily routines, her coffee preferences. The attention felt invasive and validating in equal measure. Proof she existed, but at the cost of privacy. Through it all, her private investigator kept sending reports about Denzel and the twins. Garcelle paid for information she wasn't sure she wanted, driven by the particular torture of being unable to completely sever the cord. Denzel's situation had worsened. The embezzlement charges had destroyed his reputation beyond repair. Companies he'd consulted for demanded refunds, threatened lawsuits, turned his name into shorthand for fraud. He'd moved to a neighborhood not unlike where Garcelle had once lived. Cheap rent, thin walls, survival instead of living. Noah faced actual prison time. The golden boy, who'd told his mother she didn't matter, now spent his days with lawyers trying to keep him out of federal custody. The irony was almost poetic. He'd helped his father steal from the business Garcelle had helped build. Nora worked retail at a department store that sold clothes. Similar to what Garcelle now designed, the daughter folding garments worth less than the seams her mother had stitched. She'd applied to work at Megan Originals under a different name, not realizing Garcelle ran background checks on all employees. Garcelle had rejected the application without comment. Some distances were meant to stay permanent. She should have felt satisfied watching them struggle. Should have celebrated karma finally doing its job. Instead, she felt the vast emptiness of watching strangers suffer. They'd killed the woman who loved them, and that woman didn't exist to care about their consequences. She designed a collection called Survival Isn't Pretty, garments that refused to apologize for the mess of becoming. Raw hems that celebrated instead of concealed. Asymmetrical cuts that honored bodies that had been through wars. Colors that screamed instead of whispered. The collection sold out immediately. Fashion critics called it her most honest work. Garcelle called it finally admitting that resurrection leaves scars. One evening, leaving her studio late, she was stopped by a reporter who'd been waiting outside. "Ms. Megan, can you comment on your ex-husband's legal troubles?" Garcelle looked at this stranger, asking her to perform grief or vindication or whatever would make good copy. "I have no comment about people who are no longer part of my life," she said evenly. "But surely you must feel—" "I feel nothing," Garcelle interrupted. "And that's exactly how it should be. They're strangers who happened to me once. I've moved past happening to others and started happening to myself." She walked away before any follow-up questions could land. Back in her loft, she stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a view she'd paid for with bleeding hands and sleepless nights, and the particular rage of women who decided they would not be erased. Her reflection in the glass showed someone she was still getting to know, not the ghost who'd signed divorce papers, not the desperate woman sleeping in her car. Someone new, someone built from the wreckage of who she'd been forced to be. Garcelle Megan, fashion designer, empire builder, woman who'd learned to sew her own parachute while falling through darkness. She picked up her phone and scrolled through messages from clients, from her team, from journalists wanting stories, from women thanking her for making them feel seen. Among them, one message stopped her, an invitation to serve as chief guest at a university graduation ceremony. The institution wanted to honor her as an alumna who'd attended briefly before life intervened, now returned triumphant. The university's name made her hands shake. Noah and Nora's university. The ceremony was in 2 weeks. She'd be presenting awards to distinguished graduates. Garcelle stared at the invitation until the words blurred, remembering their voices. "You're not our mother anymore." She should decline. Should protect herself from whatever pain seeing them might resurrect. Should maintain the distance that had finally stopped bleeding, but something older than self-preservation stirred in her chest. Not revenge. Revenge was too simple. This was something else. Maybe closure. Maybe the need for them to see what they dismissed. Maybe just the human hunger to be witnessed by the people who'd made you invisible. She called Peter Williams at midnight. "I need you to come with me to something," she said when he answered. "It's going to hurt, and I don't want to hurt alone." "What time should I pick you up?" Peter asked without hesitation. 2 weeks. Saturday morning. "And Peter?" "Yeah." "Thank you for not asking questions. I figured you'll tell me when you're ready," he replied. "Until then, I'm just here." Garcelle hung up and looked back at the invitation. Cream-colored paper, elegant script, a doorway to confronting ghosts she'd thought she'd buried. She had 2 weeks to prepare, 2 weeks to build, armor strong enough to face the children who'd looked at her and seen nothing worth keeping. Chapter 8. Ghosts That Won't Stay. Buried, the invitation sat on Garcelle's desk for 3 days before she could bring herself to respond. She'd stare at it between meetings, between design sessions, between moments of pretending she was functioning normally. The cream-colored paper seemed to pulse with threat disguised as honor. Chief guest, distinguished graduates, a celebration of futures built on the ruins of her past. Finally, she called the university dean and accepted with a voice that didn't shake despite her hands trembling. "We're thrilled," the dean gushed. "Your story is so inspiring, rising from divorce to build this incredible empire. Our students need to hear how you transformed adversity into success." Garcelle wanted to laugh at the sanitized version. Rising from divorce made it sound like a gentle elevation, not the brutal clawing out of a grave others had dug for her. But she made appropriate, grateful noises and hung up before the dean could hear the crack in her composure. She had 2 weeks. The first week, she threw herself into work with manic intensity. New designs poured out of her, garments that looked like rage, wearing silk, dresses that celebrated survival without prettifying it. Her team noticed the shift in energy, but said nothing, recognizing the signs of someone outrunning their own thoughts. The teacher found her in the studio at 3 a.m, hand-stitching details that could wait until business hours. "You're allowed to not be okay," the teacher said gently, setting down coffee that actually smelled good thanks to Peter's machine. "I'm fine," Garcelle lied. "You're sewing like someone's chasing you. And I've seen you do that before. Usually means something's eating you alive." Garcelle set down her needle, the truth suddenly too heavy to carry alone. "I'm going back. To where they are. My children. Giving a speech at their graduation ceremony. And I don't know if I'm doing it to prove something to them or to myself. Maybe both," the teacher offered. "Maybe that's allowed. What if seeing them break something I worked so hard to fix? Then you'll fix it again. You're good at that." The second week felt like counting down to execution. Garcelle designed the dress she'd wear, midnight blue with silver threading, similar to her first creation, but elevated to perfection. Armor disguised as elegance. She'd learned that lesson from women throughout history. Sometimes you fight battles in beautiful clothes. Peter called her daily, never asking about the ceremony directly, just checking in with the particular care of people who understand that sometimes love means holding space for pain. "You eating?" he'd ask. "Technically," she'd answer. "Sleeping?" "Also technically. Want company?" Not yet, but thank you for asking." On the Wednesday before the ceremony, Garcelle's private investigator sent an updated report. She'd told him to stop, but he'd sent it anyway with a note, "Thought you should know before you see them." The report detailed Denzel's current situation, living in a studio apartment, working as a consultant for a small firm at a fraction of his former salary. attending court-mandated therapy for stress-related health issues. The embezzlement investigation had destroyed him professionally. Friends had vanished. Professional contacts refused his calls. He'd become invisible, the exact fate he'd predicted for Garcelle. Noah's legal troubles had intensified. Federal investigators were building a case. His lawyers were negotiating plea deals. The golden boy, who told his mother she didn't matter, now spent his days trying to convince strangers he did. Nora had moved back in with Denzel, unable to afford her own place on retail wages. Mother and daughter in different circumstances. But Garcelle felt no sisterhood with Nora's situation. You couldn't claim kinship with someone who'd participated in your murder. The report included recent photographs, grainy surveillance images that felt invasive even as Garcelle studied them. Denzel looked decades older, his shoulders bent under invisible weight. Noah's face had lost its arrogant certainty, replaced with the hunted expression of people facing consequences. Nora looked tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. Garcelle stared at these images of strangers wearing familiar faces and felt nothing. Then everything, then nothing again. The emotional whiplash left her dizzy. She called Peter at midnight. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted when he answered. "Then don't," he said simply. "You don't owe them closure. You don't owe them anything. But I owe myself something, and I think that something is standing in front of them and being undeniable. Not for revenge, just for proof. Proof that I existed before them and I exist after them." "Then that's your answer," Peter replied. "You're not going for them. You're going for you." The night before the ceremony, Garcelle couldn't sleep. She stood at her loft windows, watching the city breathe, cars moving like blood cells through arterial streets, lights blinking on and off in windows where other people were also awake at unholy hours. The whole urban organism pulsing with collective insomnia. She thought about the woman who'd signed those divorce papers 3 years ago, that Garcelle had believed her entire worth was tied to being someone's wife, someone's mother. She'd measured her value by how well she served others' needs, how completely she could erase herself for their comfort. That woman was dead. Garcelle had killed her through the brutal act of survival, and standing in her grave, something new had grown. A woman who understood that taking up space wasn't selfish, it was necessary. A woman who'd learned her voice mattered even when no one was listening. A woman who'd built cathedrals from the rubble of her own heart. She looked at her reflection in the dark window. This person she'd become through sheer stubbornness and sleepless nights and the particular rage of the dismissed. She wore her power differently now, not like a costume borrowed from someone else's closet, but like a second skin she'd grown through painful molting. "They're going to see you tomorrow," she whispered to her reflection. "And they're going to realize what they threw away wasn't nothing. It was everything they needed and didn't know how to value." Her phone buzzed with a text from Peter. "Picking you up at 8. Wear that dress. It makes you look like you could burn down cities and build better ones from the ashes." She smiled, the first genuine one in days, and texted, "Back, that's the plan." Morning arrived with cruel brightness. Garcelle showered for 40 minutes, letting hot water pound against her shoulders like absolution. She dried her hair until it fell in waves that looked effortless but required effort. She did her makeup with the precision of war paint, subtle enough to look natural, strong enough to survive whatever tears might come. The midnight blue dress fit perfectly because she'd sewn it for this specific moment. It celebrated her body instead of apologizing for it, made her look powerful without trying, elegant without permission. She stared at herself in the full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. This wasn't the ghost who decorated an anniversary dinner. This was someone who'd learned to haunt others instead of being haunted. Peter arrived exactly at 8, wearing a suit that cost more than reasonable, but looked like it had been designed specifically for his body. He took one look at Garcelle and smiled. "You look like you're about to rewrite history," he observed. "Just correcting the record," she replied. They drove toward the university in comfortable silence, Peter's presence solid and steadying. The city moved past the car windows, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that someone among them was driving toward confrontation, dressed in silk and determination. "You don't have to give them anything," Peter said as they neared the campus. "Not forgiveness, not closure, not explanations. You can just exist powerfully and let that be enough." "I know," Garcelle replied, "but I want to say what they never let me say 3 years ago. I want to speak the words that got swallowed by shock and humiliation. Even if it changes nothing, I need to name what they did." "Then name it," Peter said. "Burn it down with truth." The university campus looked like money and privilege, manicured lawns, historic buildings, students who'd never had to wonder if they mattered. Garcelle had attended here briefly, decades ago, before Denzel convinced her that being his wife was more important than some education that would just gather dust. Now she returned as someone those students would learn about in entrepreneurship classes. The irony tasted bittersweet. The auditorium loomed ahead, all glass and modern architecture, built to impress donors and intimidate the merely mortal. Garcelle's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands stayed steady. "Ready?" Peter asked. "No," Garcelle admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." They walked toward the auditorium doors, toward the ceremony where her past and present would collide in front of hundreds of witnesses. Garcelle wore her armor of silk and certainty, carrying the weight of everything she'd survived and everything she'd become. Behind them, the city continued its endless motion. Ahead, the auditorium waited with its secrets and ceremonies. And inside Garcelle Megan's chest, her rebuilt heart beat steady, no longer afraid of breaking, because it had already shattered and reassembled itself into something stronger than original. Chapter 9. The Woman Who Became Impossible to Ignore. 3 years after signing those divorce papers, Garcelle Megan's name had become synonymous with resurrection itself. The documentary premiered on a streaming platform that reached millions. Phoenix Rising, Women Who Built Empires from Ashes. Garcelle's story anchored the entire film, her face filling screens worldwide as she spoke about survival with the kind of honesty that made comfortable people uncomfortable. The filmmaker had wanted to soften certain truths to make the betrayal more palatable, but Garcelle refused. "Show it raw," she'd insisted during editing. "Show that becoming yourself after erasure isn't beautiful, it's violent, it's bloody. It's waking up every day and choosing not to die when dying would be easier." The documentary won awards. Critics called it unflinching and devastating and necessary viewing. Women watched it alone in their bedrooms and wept for themselves, for their buried dreams, for the versions of themselves they'd sacrificed to keep other people comfortable. Garcelle's inbox flooded with messages from strangers. "You gave me permission to leave. You showed me I could survive. You saved my life," without knowing I existed. She read every single one. Late at night in her loft, understanding that her story had stopped being just hers. It had become a mirror where other women saw their own reflections and recognized they deserved better than invisible suffering. Fashion institutes began teaching her designs as case studies in disruption. Megan pioneered inclusive fashion. Professors lectured to students who'd grown up in a world where her innovations seemed obvious. She understood that clothes should serve women, not the other way around. Her work appeared in textbooks beside designers who'd attended prestigious schools, who'd come from money and connections. Garcelle, who'd learned to sew in a boarding house room with a salvaged machine, now sat among legends. The irony was delicious. Then came the TED Talk invitation, the kind of platform that transformed people from successful to cultural forces. Garcelle almost declined, uncomfortable with the performative nature of inspiration speeches. But Peter Williams convinced her otherwise. "You think you're just telling your story," he'd said over coffee in her studio. "But every woman watching will see her mother, her sister, herself. "You're not performing inspiration. You're giving testimony," so she accepted. The TED stage felt massive and intimate simultaneously, hundreds in the auditorium, millions watching online. Garcelle wore a custom gown she'd designed for this exact moment, deep emerald green that caught the spotlight like captured fire, flowing fabric that moved with her body instead of restricting it. The dress cost more than her first year's rent at the boarding house, a fact she mentioned deliberately in her speech. "I'm wearing a dress that costs more than I used to make in 6 months. She began, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "And I designed it myself, in a studio I own, with employees I pay fairly, in an empire I built from absolutely nothing. But before I tell you about success, let me tell you about the violence of being erased by people who claim to love you." She spoke for 18 minutes, far longer than the typical TED format allowed, but no one stopped her. She told them about the anniversary betrayal, about sleeping in her car, about the boarding house and the salvaged sewing machine, about learning that survival wasn't a destination, but a daily choice to keep breathing, despite the howling void where your identity used to live. "The people who loved me looked at me and decided I was worth nothing." "Ugh," she said, her voice breaking but pushing through. "And I believed them. Not immediately, but slowly, the way you believe anything, repeated often enough. I started seeing myself through their eyes, invisible, burdensome, disposable. And I almost stayed dead in that vision of myself." The audience sat frozen, many crying openly, recognizing something fundamental in her words. "But here's what I learned," Garcelle continued, her voice gaining strength like a storm building. "When someone tells you that you don't matter, they're not making an observation. They're making a choice. They're choosing not to see you, and you can either accept their blindness as truth, or you can become so undeniable that their refusal to see you becomes their failure, not yours." The applause when she finished lasted 4 minutes. Women rushed the stage afterward, waiting hours just to hug her, to whisper thank you like prayer, to show her photographs of their own resurrections. Businesses started, marriages left, dreams resurrected from graves marked too late. The TED Talk went viral, 20 million views in the first month, then 50 million, then numbers that stopped meaning anything except proof that her story had touched something universal. Young women quoted her words like scripture. Universities invited her to speak at commencements. Magazines featured her on covers with headlines about transformation and refusal to surrender. But the achievement that mattered most to Garcelle was the foundation. She launched it on what would have been her 23rd wedding anniversary, poetic justice turned productive. The Megan Foundation funded fashion education for women escaping domestic situations, for mothers who'd buried their dreams under everyone else's needs, for anyone who'd been told their ambitions were selfish indulgences instead of legitimate hungers. Full scholarships, no questions about their pasts, just belief in their futures. Peter Williams became her partner in this work, not romantically, though the press kept insisting, but in the deeper way of two souls who understood survival's architecture. He donated substantial funds, but never asked for control, never demanded his name on buildings or programs. Just quietly made miracles possible while Garcelle received the public credit. "Why do you do this?" she asked him once late at night in the foundation's office, surrounded by applications from women whose stories broke her heart and remade it simultaneously. "Because I remember what it felt like when someone believed in me before I believed in myself," Peter replied simply. "And I remember how many people didn't. This is how we fix that math, one woman at a time, until believing in each other becomes the default, instead of the exception." They attended charity galas. Together now, the kind of events where people who would have ignored them both once now competed for their attention. Garcelle found the irony bittersweet, watching wealthy people congratulate themselves for supporting causes they'd previously overlooked. But she played the game because the game funded scholarships and studio spaces and sewing machines for women who needed them desperately. One evening, leaving a restaurant after a foundation dinner, they were photographed. Garcelle's head thrown back in genuine laughter at something Peter had said, his hand steadying her elbow. Both of them dressed like people who'd conquered gravity and were still surprised by the view. The photograph appeared in society pages the next morning. Speculation about romance, about power couples, about whether Peter was the secret to her success. The articles made her laugh and rage in equal measure. "They can't imagine we're just friends," she told Peter over coffee, showing him the gossip columns. "Can't conceive of a man and woman caring about each other without ownership involved." "Let them speculate," Peter replied, unbothered. "What we have doesn't need their understanding or their categories. It just needs protecting." What they had was something rarer than romance. The friendship of two people who'd both survived drowning and learned to breathe underwater. They understood each other's scars without needing them explained. They held space for each other's grief without trying to fix it. They celebrated each other's victories without jealousy or competition. The world could call it whatever made them comfortable. Garcelle and Peter knew the truth. Her private investigator kept sending reports about Denzel and the twins, information she paid for despite not being certain she wanted it. Some gravitational pull kept her checking, kept her monitoring the wreckage of the family that had tried to erase her. The reports painted a picture of consequences playing out in real time. Denzel's life had collapsed completely, legal troubles, financial ruin, professional exile. He'd moved multiple times, each apartment smaller and cheaper than the last, his world shrinking in inverse proportion to Garcelle's expansion. Noah faced serious legal consequences for his role in the embezzlement scheme. The golden boy, who'd told his mother she didn't matter now, spent his days with lawyers trying to negotiate plea deals that might keep him out of federal prison. Nora worked retail, folding clothes for minimum wage, her dreams of dynasty reduced to helping customers find their sizes. She'd applied to work at Megan Originals under a different name, a detail that made Garcelle's chest ache with something between pity and rage. She'd rejected the application without comment. Some distance is needed to stay permanent. Garcelle should have felt vindicated watching their struggles, should have celebrated karma's particular justice. Instead, she felt the vast emptiness of watching strangers suffer in a language she no longer spoke. They'd killed the woman who loved them, and that woman didn't exist anymore to care about their consequences. She designed a collection called After the Apocalypse, garments that celebrated survival without prettifying the scars, asymmetrical hems that honored bodies that had been through wars, colors that shifted depending on light, reflecting how trauma changed you depending on who was looking. Raw edges left deliberately unfinished, refusing the lie that healing meant returning to original condition. The collection sold out within hours of its release. Fashion critics called it her most mature work. Garcelle called it finally admitting that you couldn't resurrect. Without first acknowledging the death, her loft apartment had transformed into a gallery of her journey, the first dress she'd ever made framed on the wall, magazine covers documenting her rise displayed like evidence of impossible survival, awards she'd won sitting on shelves beside photographs of her team, her students, the women whose lives she'd touched through the foundation. Late at night, she'd stand at her floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, watching lights blink on and off in thousands of windows where other people were also awake, also struggling, also surviving in the particular darkness that comes before dawn. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago, broken, desperate, sleeping in her car and wondering if survival was even worth the effort. She thought about every woman who'd come before her, who'd been erased and hadn't made it back. She thought about every woman still trapped in the particular prison of being told she didn't matter. And she made a promise to all of them. She would keep building, keep creating, keep proving that resurrection was possible even when you'd been buried alive by people who should have protected you. On a Tuesday afternoon, while reviewing scholarship applications in her office, Her assistant knocked tentatively. "This just arrived," the assistant said, handing her a cream-colored envelope. "It's from a university. Looks important." Garcelle opened it with hands that suddenly felt unsteady. Inside, an invitation, printed on expensive paper that felt like threat disguised as honor. The university requested her presence as chief guest at their graduation ceremony. They wanted her to present awards to distinguished graduates, to speak to students about resilience and transformation, to be the inspiration they could point to and say, "See, surviving is possible." The university's name made her chest constrict. Noah and Nora's University. The ceremony was in 2 weeks. Garcelle read the invitation 3 times, each word hitting differently. "We would be honored, your inspiring story. A role model for our graduates." Her assistant stood waiting. "Should I accept on your behalf? It's a prestigious institution. Good publicity for the foundation." Garcelle stared at the invitation until the words blurred, remembering their voices on that anniversary night. "You're not our mother anymore. You're just a burden." She should decline, should protect the peace she'd built so carefully, should maintain the distance that had finally stopped bleeding. But something older than self-preservation stirred in her chest. Not revenge exactly, but a hunger to be witnessed by the people who'd made her invisible. A need for them to see what they'd dismissed. A desire for one final confrontation, where she held all the power they'd once used to destroy her. "Accept it," Garcelle heard herself say. "Tell them I'll be honored to attend." Her assistant left with the confirmation. Garcelle sat alone in her office, holding the invitation like evidence of an approaching storm, and wondered if she was brave or foolish for walking directly into the thunder. She called Peter Williams. "I'm going back," she said when he answered. "To where they are. The university invited me to speak at graduation. Noah and Nora's graduation." Silence on the line, then. "Do you need me to come with you?" "Yes," Garcelle admitted, her voice small. "I need you to remind me who I am now when I'm standing in front of who I used to be." "I'll be there," Peter promised. "Every step." Garcelle hung up and looked at the invitation one more time. 2 weeks, 14 days to prepare for confronting the ghosts who wore her children's faces, for standing before the man who'd signed her death certificate, for speaking truth to people who'd spent 3 years learning that consequences were real and mercy was optional. She stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city that had witnessed her resurrection. Somewhere out there, Denzel was struggling to survive in a world that no longer wanted him. Somewhere, Noah was facing the reality of actions having prices. Somewhere, Nora was folding other people's dreams while her own lay buried. And here in this office, in this empire she'd built with bleeding hands and stubborn refusal to die, Garcelle Megan stood tall, powerful, undeniable. "They're going to see what they threw away," she whispered to her reflection in the glass. "And they're going to realize too late that nothing was actually everything they needed." The city lights blinked like thousands of witnesses, and Garcelle began preparing for the final confrontation, not with revenge in her heart, but with truth, which was infinitely more devastating. Chapter 10. The stage where truth wears a microphone. The auditorium glowed with celebration. Hundreds of families gathered to witness futures they believed were guaranteed. Garcelle arrived wearing midnight blue silk with silver threading that caught light like captured starlight, armor disguised as elegance. Peter Williams walked beside her, steady as gravity, his presence the only thing keeping her from turning back. Heads turned when she entered. Whispers cascaded through the crowd. "That's Garcelle Megan, the Phoenix designer." Recognition rippled outward like shock waves. Backstage, the dean greeted her with reverent enthusiasm. "Your story is so inspiring. Our students need to hear about transforming adversity into success." Garcelle smiled politely, swallowing the truth that transformation was a pretty word for the violence of clawing yourself out of a grave, while the people who buried you wondered why you wouldn't stay dead. The dean explained the ceremony. Garcelle would present awards to two distinguished graduates, Noah Cooper and Nora Cooper, remarkable young people with highest honors. The names hit like bullets. Garcelle's vision tunneled before she forced herself to breathe. Armor now, not wound. Through gaps in the curtain she saw Denzel in the audience, hollowed out, shoulders bent, sitting alone. The man who'd signed her death certificate now looked like he was attending his own funeral. In the graduate section, Noah and Nora sat frozen, their faces draining of color the moment they spotted their mother on stage. The ceremony began. The university president spoke about excellence and bright futures before introducing Garcelle with practiced enthusiasm. Applause crashed like thunder as she walked onto that stage. The spotlight hit her face. Then she could see them all. Hundreds of witnesses about to watch a family's private apocalypse become public testimony. "Thank you," she began, her voice carrying across the silent space. "I'm here to present awards to distinguished graduates. But first, let me talk about what distinguishes us, not our degrees, but our survival." She looked directly at Noah and Nora, sitting rigid in their seats. "I want to speak to the women in this audience, to mothers who buried their dreams so their children could dream bigger, to wives who made themselves small so their husbands could feel large, to every woman told that sacrifice is love and silence is strength." The auditorium held its breath. "I want to tell you about a woman who spent 20 years building a home, only to discover she'd been constructing her own prison, who gave her youth to fevers and school lunches, who abandoned her education, her career, her identity, believing that's what love required. Complete self-erasure. Tears already streamed down faces throughout the crowd. This woman gave everything. Her beauty to sleepless nights, her ambitions to other people's achievements. She gave so much that eventually nothing remained of who she'd been before. Just a ghost moving through rooms doing invisible labor while everyone wondered why she wasn't happier." Her voice broke, but she pushed through. And then, one day, on what should have been a celebration, the people she'd sacrificed everything for looked at her and decided she was worthless. Her own children, the humans she grew inside her body, told her she wasn't their mother anymore, that she was nothing, a burden to be erased. Noah's face was in his hands. Nora sobbed openly. Denzel wept without shame. "I want every mother here to know, your sacrifice was real. Every dream deferred, every ambition buried, every version of yourself you abandoned. It mattered. You mattered. And if the people you sacrifice for can't see that, the failure is theirs, not yours." Garcelle wiped tears from her face, her voice finding steel. "I want every daughter to know, your mothers are human beings. They had dreams before they had you. They had identities beyond servicing your needs. They gave up pieces of themselves to build you. And the cruelest thing you can do is look at that sacrifice and call it nothing." She looked directly at Nora, collapsed forward in her seat. "To sons who think their mother's worth is tied to silent suffering, your mother's love isn't measured by her willingness to disappear. It's measured by the pieces of herself she gave you even when you didn't notice, didn't appreciate, didn't care." The dean looked panicked, but no one moved to stop her. "Now," Garcelle said, voice hardening, "I'm supposed to present awards to Noah Cooper and Nora Cooper. Would they please come to the stage?" The auditorium gasped collectively. Whispers exploded like wildfire as people connected the dots. Noah and Nora climbed the stairs like people walking toward execution. They stood before her, unable to meet her eyes. "Congratulations on your achievements," Garcelle said, holding the certificates. "But standing here, all I can think about is the night you told me I wasn't your mother anymore. 3 years ago, my anniversary, I'd decorated with flowers and candles. I'd written a letter about 20 years of love." Her voice cracked. "And you stood there while your father handed me divorce papers. You watched him erase me from the business I'd helped build. And when I asked why, you told me I was nothing, that I was just this pathetic presence you'd outgrown." Noah tried to speak. "Mom, please." "Don't," Garcelle cut him off. Don't call me that now when you stripped it from me then. Don't cry when you smiled that night watching me sign away everything. She looked at Nora. You told me I suffocated you with my neediness. The cruel irony? I'd made myself so small, trying not to burden you, that I'd practically disappeared. But even my ghost was too much. We were wrong, Nora managed through sobs. We were so wrong. You understood perfectly, Garcelle interrupted. You understood that I loved you more than I loved myself. And you used that love like a weapon. She extended the certificates, forcing them to take them with shaking hands. I came here not to forgive you. I came to name what you did, to say out loud, in front of all these witnesses, that you murdered the woman who loved you. You killed your mother as surely as if you'd used your hands. The auditorium dissolved into chaos, people sobbing, gasping, frozen in horrified fascination. I forgive life for what it taught me through you, Garcelle continued, tears flowing but voice steady. I forgive myself for loving you so completely that I forgot to love myself. But I will never forgive the betrayal, never forgive being erased by people I would have died for. She set down the microphone. Its feedback screamed briefly through the auditorium like something breaking. I hope you have good lives, she said quietly to them. I hope you learn to value people before they're forced to prove their worth through absence. Then she turned away, from Noah collapsing to his knees, from Nora reaching out with hands that couldn't bridge 3 years, from the ceremony dissolving around them. She walked down the stairs toward Peter Williams, who waited with his hand extended. She took it, and they moved toward the exit while chaos erupted behind them. Outside, afternoon sun hit her face like absolution. The campus looked serene, gardens blooming, paths winding through perfect lawns. You did it, Peter said softly. You made them see. Did I? Garcelle asked, feeling vast emptiness and strange relief. You gave testimony for every woman who's ever been erased, Peter replied. They walked to his car. Garcelle didn't look back. She'd said everything that needed saying, proven she existed without their permission. She got in the car. Peter drove away from the campus, away from the past. Where to? He asked. Forward, Garcelle replied. Just forward. The afternoon light painted everything gold. In the passenger seat, Garcelle Megan, fashion designer, empire builder, woman who'd refused to die when dying would have been easier, sat with her head held high and her heart finally, impossibly, her own again. Some stories don't end with forgiveness. Some stories end with a woman finally learning she was never the one who needed forgiving. And as they drove toward whatever came next, Garcelle whispered, I existed before them. I exist after them. And I am undeniable now. The city lights blinked their agreement, and the car carried her forward, toward the rest of her life, which belonged to no one but herself.